The fog crept in like a living thing, tendrils of mist curling around tree trunks and obscuring the forest floor. I checked my watch. 4:37 p.m. Daylight was fading fast, and with it my confidence. I'd been hiking these trails for years, but something felt off today. The familiar landmarks I relied on seemed to have vanished, leaving me surrounded by an endless sea of identical trees. I pulled out my GPS, hoping it would provide some clarity. The screen flickered weakly before or going dark, dead battery, no signal. I couldn't be sure either way. I was on my own now. "Stay calm, Sarah," I muttered to myself. "You've got this." But as the minutes ticked by and darkness settled over the woods, panic began to set in. The trees loomed larger, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision. Was it just my imagination, or were the trees actually shifting around me? A chill wind cut through my jacket. The temperature was dropping rapidly, far faster than normal for this time of year. My breath came out in visible puffs as I hugged myself for warmth. That's when I heard it, a low mournful howl echoing through the trees. It was joined by other eerie sounds, rustling leaves, creaking branches, and something that sounded disturbingly like whispers. My heart raced as I picked up my pace, no longer caring which direction I went as long as it was away from those sounds. Rain began to fall, icy droplets stinging my face. Within minutes, I was soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. Exhaustion weighed heavily on me. How long had I been walking? Hours? Days? Time seemed to have lost all meaning in this nightmarish forest. Just as I was about to collapse in despair, I saw it, a faint glow through the trees. Hope surged through me as I stumbled towards the light. As I drew closer, I could make out the silhouette of a small cabin. It looked old and worn, with weathered wooden walls and a sagging roof, but right now it was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. I practically fell against the door, my numb fingers fumbling with the handle. To my surprise, it swung open easily. I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind me and leaning against it as I caught my breath. I stepped into the cabin, my sodden clothes dripping onto the worn wooden floorboards. The warmth hit me like a wall, instantly soothing my chilled bones. A fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. The scent of wood smoke mingled with something savory that made my stomach growl. My eyes were drawn to a pot simmering on an old cast-iron stove. Steam rose from it, carrying the aroma of herbs and meat. My mouth watered at the thought of hot stew after hours of trudging through the cold forest. I shrugged off my wet jacket, hanging it on a peg by the door. The cabin was small but cozy, with a lived-in feel that belied its seemingly abandoned exterior. A plush armchair sat invitingly near the fire. A patchwork quilt draped over his back. Bookshelves lined one wall, crammed with well-worn volumes. As I moved further into the room, something caught my eye. A clock hung on the wall, its face ornate and clearly antique, but as I watched, the hands moved steadily counterclockwise. I blinked, sure I must be seeing things, but no, the clock continued its backwards journey through time. Unsettled, I turned away, only to notice something equally strange. The window to my left showed a clear night sky, stars twinkling brightly, but when I glanced at the window on the opposite wall, I saw driving rain lashing against the glass. My brow furrowed as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Part of me knew I should be alarmed, that I should turn and flee back into the forest, but a stronger part of me felt utterly at peace here, as if I'd finally come home after a long journey. I sank into the armchair by the fire, pulling the quilt around my shoulders. The stew on the stove smelled divine, and I found myself wondering if there might be bowls in one of the cupboards. "This is crazy," I muttered to myself. "I don't even know whose house this is." But even as I said the words, they felt hollow. Some deeper part of me insisted that I belonged here, that I'd been expected. The fire popped and crackled, as if in agreement. I jolted awake, my heart pounding. A deafening crack had shattered the peaceful silence of the cabin. For a moment, I was disoriented, struggling to remember where I was. Then it all came flooding back, the forest, the fog, finding the strange yet comforting shelter. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized something was terribly wrong. The cozy cabin I'd fallen asleep in had vanished. In its place was a dilapidated ruin. The walls, once solid and inviting, were now crumbling, with yellowed wallpaper peeling away in long strips. The floorboards creaked ominously beneath me as I stood, setting up small clouds of dust. A musty, dank smell assaulted my nostrils, reminiscent of long abandoned places in decay. The fire that had burned so cheerfully in the hearth was nothing but cold ashes now. The clock on the wall had stopped, its hands frozen at an impossible angle. "What the hell?" I whispered, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. I stumbled towards the front door, my mind reeling. This couldn't be the same place. It was as if decades had passed in the span of a few hours. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, dreading what I might find outside. The door creaked open and I gasped. Gone was the misty forest I'd stumbled through. Instead, a vast red desert stretched as far as the eye could see. The sun hung low on the horizon, bathing everything in an eerie blood-red glow. Dunes of rusty sand rippled to the horizon, broken only by the occasional jutting rock formation. The air that rushed in was hot and dry, carrying the scent of dust and something alien I couldn't quite place. In the distance, I saw what looked like the skeletal remains of long-dead trees, their branches reaching due towards the sky like gnarled fingers. Panic clawed at my throat. This was impossible. It had to be a dream, a hallucination. I pinched myself hard, wincing at the pain, but the surreal landscape remained unchanged. No, 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 I muttered, backing away from the door. This isn't real. It can't be real. I slammed the door shut, leaning against it, as if I could hold back the impossible world outside through sheer force of will. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The cabin creaked and groaned around me, as if it too was struggling to maintain its form in this alien environment. Demies danced in the sickly light filtering through grimy windows. The musty smell seemed stronger now, tinged with something acrid that made my eyes water. I slid down to the floor, hugging my knees to my chest. The rough wood of the door pressed against my back, the only thing that felt solid and real in this nightmare. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up, to find myself back in the normal world. But when I opened them again, nothing had changed. The decrepit cabin still surrounded me, a far cry from the welcoming shelter I'd found in the forest. And beyond its walls lay a desert that couldn't exist. I buried my face in my hands, trying to stifle the sobs that threatened to overwhelm me. What was happening? Where was I? And more importantly, how could I get back home? I stood up on shy legs, my mind reeling as I tried to process the impossible changes around me. The dilapidated cabin creaked and groaned as if struggling to maintain its form in this alien environment. Dust motes danced in the sickly light filtering through grimy windows. The musty smell seemed stronger now, tinged with something acrid that made my eyes water. My gaze fell on a door I hadn't noticed before. It must lead to the living room. With trembling fingers, I grasped the tarnished brass knob and turned it slowly. The door swung open with a drawn-out creak that set my teeth on edge. I gasped as a wave of humid air washed over me. Where there should have been a normal living room, a lush jungle sprawled before my eyes. Massive trees towered overhead, their canopies blocking out most of the light. Vines draped from branch to branch, and exotic flowers bloomed in vibrant hues I'd never seen before. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and vegetation. "This isn't possible," I whispered, but my words were swallowed by the cacophony of jungle sounds. Birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling in an unfelt breeze. I took a hesitant step forward, leaves and fallen fronds crunching beneath my feet. The door swung shut behind me with a soft click, and when I whirled around, it had vanished completely. My heart raced as I realized I was now fully immersed in this impossible jungle. As I moved deeper into the foliage, pushing aside giant leaves and ducking under low, everywhere and nowhere at once. I spun around, trying to locate the source, but the cavern appeared empty, save for the glowing fungi and animated cave paintings. A cold draft brushed against my skin, carrying with it the musty scent of age and decay. The whispers grew louder still, and I had the distinct impression that unseen presences were closing in around me. The air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on me from all sides. Panic seized me as the voices reached a fever pitch. I could feel them now, invisible entities brushing against me, their touch leaving trails of icy coldness on my skin. The cave paintings seemed to rise more violently, the primitive figures reaching out as if trying to break free from the stone. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on an unseen obstacle. As I regained my balance, I realized with horror that the stairs had vanished. The cavern stretched out in all directions, with no sign of the way I had come. The whispers formed a deafening chorus now, filled with an urgency and malevolence that sent waves of terror through me. I could no longer distinguish individual sounds or words, just an overwhelming sigh that threatened to drive me mad. Desperate, I picked a direction at random and ran. My feet pounded against the stone floor as I sprinted through the twisting caverns, the phosphorescent fungi blurring into streaks of sickly light. The whispers pursued me, growing louder and more frenzied with each step. Just as I felt my strength failing, my outstretched hand struck wood. A door! I grasped the handle and wrenched it open, throwing myself through the opening. I slammed it shut behind me, cutting off the whispers mid-able. I stepped into the kitchen, my nerves still frayed from the encounter in the basement. The familiar sight of worn countertops and outdated appliances offered a brief moment of normalcy. I leaned against the sink, trying to catch my breath and make sense of everything I'd experienced. Suddenly, the air around me shimmered like heat waves rising from hot pavement. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, the kitchen had transformed completely. Gone were the modern appliances, replaced by a massive stone hearth and rough wooden tables. Herbs hung from the rafters, and the smell of wood smoke filled the air. What the? I gasped, spinning around to take in the medieval scene. A door burst open, and a man in blood-stained chainmail stumbled in, brandishing a sword. His wild eyes locked onto me, and he raised his weapon with a snarl. I ducked just as the blade whistled over my head, embedding itself in the wooden beam behind me. Heart pounding, I scrambled away on all fours, searching desperately for a way out. The air shimmered again, and the medieval kitchen dissolved. In its place, sleek metal surfaces and glowing screens appeared. Robotic arms whirred and clicked, preparing meals with inhuman precision. I barely had time to process the change when one of the robotic arms jerked violently, spraying that, hanging vines. An uneasy feeling crept over me. The jungle sounds seemed to shift, growing quieter in some areas, while intensifying in others. It felt as if the very air was watching me. A twig snapped somewhere to my left, and I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I sensed, rather than saw, movement in the undergrowth. Something large was out there, stalking me. I caught a glimpse of sleek dark fur through a gap in the leaves. A low growl rumbled through the air, setting my nerves on fire. Whatever this creature was, it wasn't like any animal I'd ever encountered. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I backed away slowly. Leaves rustled as the unseen predator moved closer. I caught another glimpse, gleaming eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light, razor-sharp claws that left deep gouges in the tree bark. Terror propelled me into action. I turned and ran, no longer caring about the direction, focused only on escape. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I crashed through the underbrush. The creature's growl rose to a roar, the sound so alien and terrifying that it sent shivers down my spine. I burst through a curtain of vines and found myself back in the main hall of the cabin. Without thinking, I slammed the door shut, just as something massive collided with it from the other side. An otherworldly roar shook the entire structure, vibrating through my bones. I climbed the creaking stairs, my heart pounding with each step. The worn wood groaned beneath my feet, as if protesting my ascent. At the top, a long hallway stretched before me, lined with numerous doors on both sides. The faded wallpaper peeled in places, revealing glimpses of the plaster beneath. I approached the first door on my right, my hand trembling as I reached for the tarnished brass knob. It turned with surprising ease, and I pushed the door open. My jaw dropped. Instead of the dusty abandoned room I'd expected, I found myself staring into a stark white futuristic laboratory. The contrast was so jarring that for a moment, I thought I must be hallucinating. Hesitantly, I stepped inside. The air was cool and sterile, carrying a faint chemical scent. Bright fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the gleaming surfaces. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens displaying incomprehensible data and diagrams. But what truly caught my attention were the rows of large cylindrical tubes that dominated the center of the room. Each was filled with a pale blue liquid, bubbles. Rising lazily to the surface and floating within each tube was a humanoid figure. I moved closer, my curiosity overriding my fear. The figures appeared to be in some sort of stasis, their eyes closed and limbs floating weightlessly in the liquid. As I peered into one of the TU, my blood ran cold. The face staring back at me was my own. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. It was impossible, and yet there it was, a perfect replica of me suspended in that eerie blue fluid. I looked from tube to tube, realizing with growing horror that each contained a slightly different version of myself. Some looked older, some younger, some bore scars or alterations I couldn't begin to comprehend. A sudden piercing alarm shattered the silence. Red lights began to flash, and a computerized voice blared from hidden speakers. Alert. Unauthorized presence detected. Initiating security protocols. Panic seized me. I spun around, ready to flee, only to find that the door I'd entered through had vanished. The smooth white walls showed no sign of an exit. The alarm continued to wail as I frantically searched for a way out. The tubes began to bubble more vigorously, and I could have sworn I saw one of my doppelgangers twitch. My heart raced as I pounded on the walls, desperation mounting with each passing second. Just as I was about to give in to despair, a section of the wall slid open, revealing the hallway beyond. I didn't hesitate. I bolted through the opening, not daring to look back. The alarm faded as I ran, replaced by the sound of my own ragged breathing and pounding footsteps on the creaking floorboards. I found myself back in the dilapidated hallway, surrounded once more by peeling wallpaper and worn wood. The door to the futuristic lab had vanished, as if it had never existed. Gasping for breath, I leaned against the wall, trying to make sense of what I just experienced. The image of those tubes filled with AV variants of myself was burned into my mind. What were they? Why were they there? And what would have happened if I'd been caught? I descended the creaky wooden stairs into the basement, my heart pounding with each step. The air grew colder and damper as I ventured deeper underground. At the bottom, I found myself in a dark, cavernous space that seemed to stretch far beyond the confines of the house above. As my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I noticed an eerie blue-green glow emanating from patches on the walls and floor. Phosphorescent fungi clung to the damp stone, casting strange shadows that seemed to writhe and dance in my peripheral vision. The light was just enough to reveal ancient cave paintings covering the rocky surfaces. I moved closer to examine one of the paintings, a crude depiction of humanoid figures engaged in some kind of ritual. As I stared, a chill ran down my spine. The figures appeared to be moving, their limbs twitching and contorting in a silent, primitive dance. I blinked hard, convinced it must be a trick of the light, but when I looked again, the movement continued. A faint whisper reached my ears, barely audible at first. It grew steadily louder, a silent hiss in a language I couldn't understand. The words, if they were words, seemed to slither through the air, wrapping around me like incorporeal tendrils. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing off the cave walls. "Is anyone there?" The whispers intensified in response, a cacophony of otherworldly voices that seemed to come from sparks. It swung towards me, its sharp appendages snapping like pincers. "No, no, no!" I cried, diving under a nearby counter. The malfunctioning robot smashed into the spot where I'd been standing, leaving a deep gouge in the metal surface. I crawled frantically, dodging falling debris as more machines began to shine short-circuit around me. Just as I thought I couldn't take any more, the air shimmered once again. The futuristic kitchen melted away, replaced by a primordial scene. Massive ferns and strange ancient plants surrounded me. The air was thick and humid, filled with the buzz of prehistoric insects. A low growl froze me in place. Slowly, I turned to see a velociraptor stalking towards me, its sickle-shaped claws clicking against the stone floor. Its eyes gleamed with predatory intelligence as it sized me up. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The shifts seemed to happen every few minutes. If I could just survive until the next one. The raptor lunged, and I threw myself to the side, feeling the rush of air as its jaws snapped shut inches from my leg. I scrambled to my feet and ran, weaving between the giant ferns. The air began to shimmer, and I silently prayed for the next shift to come quickly. The raptor's hot breath was on my heels as the prehistoric world began to dissolve around us. With a final burst of speed, I leapt forward just as the kitchen transformed once again. I crashed into a familiar countertop, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Gasping, I spun around, but the Velociraptor was gone. I was back in the normal, run-down kitchen of the house. I pushed open the bathroom door, my hand trembling on the tarnished brass knob. The hinges creaked ominously as I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through a grimy window. The air was thick with the musty scent of mold and disuse. My gaze fell on the large mirror above the sink, its surface clouded with age. As I approached, I expected to see my own haggard reflection staring back at me. Instead, I gasped in shock. The mirror didn't show my reflection at all. Instead, I saw a version of myself I didn't recognize. This Sarah stood taller, her posture confident and her clothes immaculate. She smiled at me, a look of pity in her eyes. "What the hell?" I whispered, reaching out to touch the glass. The image shifted, and I recoiled in horror. Now I saw myself twisted and deformed, my skin mottled and my limbs bent at unnatural angles. The Sarah's eyes were filled with pain and desperation. I stumbled backward. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and another version of me appeared. This one looked older, with streaks of gray in her hair and lines of worry etched into her face. She seemed to be shouting, but I couldn't hear her words. More versions of myself flashed across the mirror's surface, each one different from the last. I saw myself as a celebrated scientist holding a Nobel Prize, then as a homeless woman huddled on a street corner, a soldier in combat fatigues, a bedridden invalid. The images came faster and faster, a dizzying kaleidoscope of possible lives. "Stop," I cried out, covering my eyes with my hands, but I couldn't block out the knowledge of what I was seeing. These were all me, all versions of Sarah from different realities. The thought made my head spin. When I lowered my hands, I saw that one image had stabilized in the mirror. It was me, but with a wild, desperate look in her eyes. This Sarah pressed her hands against the glass from the other side, her mouth moving frantically. I took a step closer, straining to understand what she was trying to say. Suddenly, her hand shot through the surface of the mirror, shattering the barrier between our realities. Her fingers grasped at the air, trying to reach me. I screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the bathtub and falling hard onto the cold tile floor. The other Sarah's arm flailed wildly, stretching impossibly far as she tried to drag me into her world. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, looking around frantically for something, anything to defend myself. My eyes fell on a heavy ceramic soap dish sitting on the edge of the sink. Without thinking, I grabbed it and hurled it at the mirror with all my strength. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, fragments flying in every direction. I threw my arms up to protect my face, feeling sharp stings as shards sliced into my skin. When I lowered my arms, I saw that each broken piece of the mirror had become a tiny portal. In one, I glimpsed a world of fire and ash, and another a lush paradise. Countless realities, countless versions of myself, all visible in the scattered fragments. The arm that had reached through was gone, leaving behind only a smear of blood on the remaining shards. But as I watched, horrified, I saw movement in several of the larger pieces. More versions of myself pressing against the boundaries of their realities, trying to break through. I backed away, my shoes crunching on broken glass. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to process what I was seeing. The bathroom door seemed miles away, but I knew I had to reach it. I couldn't stay here, surrounded by these fractured glimpses of other lives, other selves. With a final terrified look at the shattered mirror and its myriad portals, I turned and ran from the bathroom room. I slammed the door behind me, leaning against it as if my weight could keep the horrors contained. I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, dust motes swirling in the beam of my flashlight. The wooden steps creaked ominously under my weight as I ascended. At the top, I pushed open a heavy trapdoor and hoisted myself into the musty space beyond. The attic stretched out before me, a vast repository of forgotten treasures and discarded memories. Cobwebs draped every surface like awesomer curtains, and the air was thick with the scent of old paper and aging wood. My flashlight beam cut through the all. I spun in a circle, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the attic, but there was no sign of an exit. No way out. Panic began to rise in my chest, threatening to overwhelm me. I forced myself to take deep breaths, trying to stay calm. Panicking would only feed the cabin, make it stronger. I had to find a way out of this nightmare. But even as I struggled to maintain my composure, I could feel the cabin's malevolent presence pressing in on me. The walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and whispers just beyond the edge of hearing tickled at my consciousness. I stumbled through the cabin's hallway, my vision blurring as exhaustion and fear took their toll. The walls around me seemed to pulse and shift, reality bending before my eyes. I blinked hard, trying to focus, but when I opened my eyes again, the scene had changed completely. The wooden floorboards beneath my feet gave way to lush grass, dotted with wild flowers. To my left, the wall had transformed into a dense forest, trees stretching impossibly, high into a twilight sky. On my right, the wall rippled like water, revealing glimpses of a bustling cityscape beyond. I took a tentative step forward, my shoes sinking into the soft earth. The air felt thick, charged with an otherworldly energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I moved, the environment continued to shift and change around me. A gust of wind blew past, carrying with it the scent of sea salt. I turned to see a stretch of sandy beach had appeared, waves lapping at the shore. But the water wasn't blue. It was a deep, swirling purple, dotted with bioluminescent creatures I'd never seen before. "What's happening?" I whispered, my voice trembling. As if in response, a low rumble shook the ground beneath my feet. The hallway began to twist and warp, suctions of different realities bleeding into one another. I watched in horror as the forest merged with the beach, trees growing out of the sand at impossible angles. The city skyline in the distance melted like wax, skyscrapers bending and flowing into new alien shapes. I pressed on, each step bringing new surprises and terrors. One moment I was wading through knee-deep snow. The next I was dodging floating chunks of debris in a zero-gravity environment. The transitions between realities became more jarring, more chaotic. A creature scuttled past, part crab, part machine, its metal pincers clicking against the now crystalline floor. I stumbled backward, only to collide with something soft and yielding. Spinning around, I found myself face to face with a being of pure light, its form constantly shifting and pulsing. "Please," I begged, though I wasn't sure if it could understand me. "I need to get out of here." The light being's form flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw a human face within its glow. But before I could be sure, it dissolved into a shower of sparks, each one opening a tiny portal to yet another reality. I pushed forward, my progress becoming more difficult with each step. The hallway had become a maze of conflicting environments. In one section, I had to crawl through a narrow tunnel of rock, while the next required me to swim through a gelatinous substance that clung to my skin. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Had I been in this chaotic hallway for minutes or hours, days? The constant shifts and changes were taking their toll on my mind. I could feel my grip on reality slipping, my thoughts becoming as fragmented as the world around me. A distant roar caught my attention. I turned to see a massive creature, part dragon, part machine, barreling towards me. Its scales gleamed with a metallic sheen, and jets of flame erupted from vents along its body. I dove to the side, rolling across a patch of what felt like bubble wrap, each pop opening a tiny window to another world. As I scrambled to my feet, I realized with growing dread that the hallway was becoming more unstable by the second. Entire sections were disappearing, replaced by swirling vortexes of energy. The boundaries between realities were breaking down completely. "I have to find a way out," I gasped, forcing myself to keep moving, despite the exhaustion weighing down my limbs. I could feel the cabin's hunger growing, its desire to consume me and add my essence to its chaotic tapestry of realities. The thought spurred me on, giving me a burst of desperate energy as I ran, jumped, and crawled through the ever-changing landscape. I caught glimpses of other versions of myself, some trapped in their own realities, pounding against invisible barriers. Others seemed to be navigating the chaos as I was, our paths crossing for brief moments before diverging again. The hallway narrowed, the chaos intensifying. Gravity shifted wildly. One moment I was running along the ceiling, the next I was falling sideways through a field of floating crystals. My mind struggled to process the constant barrage of sensory input. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I spotted something ahead, a door that seemed to remain constant amidst the swirling chaos. It pulsed with an energy that felt different from the rest of the cabin, more focused and intense. I pushed myself towards it, fighting against the shifting realities that seemed determined to hold me back. As I got closer, I could feel the power emanating from beyond that door. Whatever lay behind it, I knew it held the key to understanding this place and possibly escaping it. With a final burst of effort, I reached out and grasped the doorknob. The metal felt hot under my palm, vibrating with barely contained energy. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever lay beyond. I pushed open the door and stepped into a room unlike anything I had ever seen before. The walls, floor, and ceiling seemed to be made of pure energy, pulsing and shifting in a kaleidoscope of colors. At the center of the room was a swirling vortex of light, its core a blinding white that hurt my eyes to look at directly. The air crackled with electricity, making the hair on my arms stand on end. I could feel the raw power emanating from the vortex, washing over me in waves that made my skin tingle and my head spin. This, I realized with a mixture of awe and terror, was the heart of the cabin. As I took a tentative step forward, the room around me warped and twisted. One moment I was standing on solid ground, the next I was floating in a void filled with stars. Reality itself seemed fluid here, changing from second to second. I clutched the physicist's journal tightly to my chest, its weight the only constant in the sea of chaos. My eyes darted around, trying to make sense of my surroundings. In one corner I saw a glimpse of my childhood bedroom, in another a futuristic cityscape I didn't recognize. The visions flickered and changed faster than I could process them. "Focus, Sarah," I muttered to myself, fighting against the disorientation. I forced myself to look at the vortex again, squinting against its brilliance. As I watched, I began to understand. The swirling mass of energy was the nexus point, the place where all the different realities converged. It was the source of the cabin's power, the thing that allowed it to bend and shape reality at will. I flipped open the journal, scanning the pages frantically for any information that might help. My eyes fell on a hastily scribbled note. The core must remain stable. Any significant disruption could cause a cascade effect, potentially collapsing all connected realities. My heart raced as I processed the implications. If I could destabilize the core, it might be enough to break the cabin's hold and allow me to escape. But the risk was enormous. If I failed, I could be trapped in a random reality forever, or worse, cause the destruction of countless worlds. I took a deep breath, weighing my options. Stay here and be consumed by the cabin, or take a desperate gamble for freedom? The choice seemed impossible, but I knew I had to act. Steeling myself, I began to move towards the vortex. Each step was a struggle, as if I was walking through thick syrup. The room continued to shift and change around me, sometimes expanding to vast distances, other times shrinking until I felt claustrophobic. As I got closer to the core, I could feel its pull on me, both physical and mental. Memories and thoughts that weren't my own flashed through my mind, lives I had never lived, experiences I had never had. It was overwhelming, threatening to drown out my sense of self. "No," I gritted out, forcing myself to focus on who I was, on my goal. "I won't let you take me." I reached out towards the vortex, my hand trembling. The energy coursing through the air made my skin burn, but I pushed through the pain, just a little closer. Suddenly, a figure materialized in front of me, another version of myself. Her eyes were wide with panic. "Don't," she cried. "You don't know what you're doing." I hesitated for a moment, my hand inches from the swirling energy. "I have to," I said, my voice cracking. "It's the only way out." "But at what cost?" she pleaded. "Think of all the lives you'll be affecting, all the realities you might destroy." Her words hit me like a physical blow, making me pause. Was I really willing to risk everything, to potentially cause untold destruction, just for a chance at escape? But even as I wavered, I felt the cabin's hunger growing stronger. It was now or never. With a silent apology to all the versions of myself I might be dooming, I steeled my resolve. "I'm sorry," I whispered, both to the other Sarah and to myself, "but I have to try." Before she could stop me, I plunged my hand into the vortex. The world exploded into blinding light and searing pain. I screamed as I felt reality fracture around me, the very fabric of existence tearing apart. The last thing I saw before everything went white was the other Sarah's face. A mixture of horror and understanding etched across her features. Then there was nothing but chaos, and the sensation of falling through an endless void. I opened my eyes to find myself sprawled on the forest floor, pine needles poking into my skin. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the scent of evergreens. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above, dappling the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. For a moment I just lay there, gasping for breath. My head throbbed and every muscle in my body ached as if I'd run a marathon. Slowly, I pushed myself up to a sitting position, leaves and twigs clinging to my clothes. Behind me, where the cabin had stood, there was nothing but a clearing. The ground was scorched and bare, as if a fire had raged through the area. Wisps of smoke still curled up from the blackened earth. "It's gone," I whispered, my voice hoarse. I did it." Relief washed over me, so intense it made me dizzy. I'd escaped. The nightmare was over. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to shout my triumph to the sky. But as the initial euphoria faded, a creeping doubt began to set in. I looked around, taking in my surroundings more carefully. The forest seemed familiar, the same one I'd been hiking through when I first stumbled upon the cabin. But something felt off. The colors seemed too vivid, the shadows too deep. When I focused on individual trees, their bark appeared to shift and swirl in impossible patterns, and the bird song echoing through the woods had an eerie, almost mechanical quality to it. "No," I muttered, shaking my head. "It can't be." I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the protest of my aching body. I had to get out of here, to find civilization. Maybe then I could confirm that this was really my world, that I'd truly escaped. As I started to hike away from the clearing, my steps faltering and uncertain, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush, every snapping twig made me jump. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly. No matter how far I walked, I couldn't find any sign of a trail or road. The sun remained fixed in the same position overhead, never moving despite what felt like hours passing. Panic began to build in my chest. What if I hadn't escaped at all? What if this was just another of the cabin's realities? A more elaborate illusion designed to torment me? I paused, leaning against a tree to catch my breath. As I did, I noticed something carved into the bark, a series of strange symbols that looked disturbingly similar to those I'd seen in the physicist's journal. My heart sank. This couldn't be a coincidence. Either I was still trapped in the cabin's web of realities, or my actions had irreparably altered my own world. Either way, the implications were terrifying. I sank to the ground, my back against the tree, and buried my face in my hands. The forest continued its eerie song around me, oblivious to my distress. I was free of the cabin, but at what cost? And could I ever truly be certain that I'd escaped?